Any fan of Scream has no doubt seen a million YouTube video essays all talking about the same 3 topics. How Scream turned the slasher genre tropes upside down, who killed who in Scream 1, and why Scream 5 is a perfect film. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with these kinds of videos, but there's so much more to discuss about this series beyond the same exhausted video ideas that it's a real shame more people aren't going over different angles. Maybe it's my journalistic background, or maybe it's Ghostface's recent addition to Mortal Kombat 1, but I noticed a major theme in the first film that I feel is way too commonly overlooked by fans. It is so major, in fact, that I'd argue it's the main thesis of the film's figurative argumentative essay. And to fully understand what that theme is, let me take you back to the late 20th century in the 80s and 90s with the rise of a phenomenon now known as the Satanic Panic. Since the beginning of time, every generation has had something that's been used as a scapegoat for the poisoned youth. In the modern day, it's the debate over if video games cause violence. Before that, it was if horror movies cause violence. Before that, rock music. Before that, comic books, and so on. And every time this happens, it only makes the scapegoat more appealing because it's viewed by kids as rebellious and cool.
How do you feel about cutting his head off?
Nowhere was this idea more prevalent than during the era of the Satanic Panic, a 2-decade-long period where anything and everything was seen as a threat to the nuclear American family. Dungeons and Dragons was the devil, Pokemon was the devil, and perhaps worst of all, horror films were the devil. In the 80s, the classic slasher subgenre of horror responded to this in part with the release of Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven. The media and parents at the time were pushing an agenda that these movies were demonic, and so, to prey and comment on those fears, Freddy Krueger was born. A demonic slasher who primarily assaults your mind, but only has power when it's given to him by those who fear him. A pretty interesting, but overall more minor theme from that film. But as horror started to dwindle in popularity and the media's argument became more commonly accepted over the next decade, I believe that the team behind Scream became frustrated by this and decided to clap back with an entire film dedicated to refuting the argument that horror was causing people to become violent or take interest in the occult while simultaneously shoving a mirror in the faces of mainstream news outlets. To me, Scream is an obvious hit piece on the sensationalized media landscape of the late 20th century and contains messaging that's relevant even today, 3 decades after the fact. Lending further proof to this is the famous origin of how screenwriter Kevin Williamson got the idea for the story. When most people talk about this section of the movie's history, they'll tell you that it was all inspired by the story of the real-life Gainesville killer, whose atrocities terrified Williamson to the point of channeling his anxiety into the script. But what I think Scream shows us suggests a slightly different version of this background. Have you ever considered that it may not have been the killer who inspired the film directly, but instead the news report that Williamson watched about the killer itself? It was heavily dramatized, fear-mongering journalism designed to maximize viewer retention. This news team was directly profiting from scaring the general public. Kind of like a certain genre demonized by those same media companies. Evidence for Scream trying to make an argument against the Satanic Panic and news outlets pushing those concepts is littered throughout the film. There are some more minor lines throughout that exemplify this, like when the cop talks about kids nowadays, or when this news reporter asks if any students were involved in the occult. But the most prominent place that this idea is explored is in its depiction of teenagers. I mean, even beyond the killers, everyone in this movie is just so evil to one another. And this is primarily shown within their high school. It starts when these two unempathetic boys chase people around in Ghostface costumes, making light of the terrible things that happened to one of their classmates just a night prior. Then we have the girls in the bathroom theorizing about how and why Sydney made the whole thing up for attention. They insult this traumatized girl and her murdered mother, who they presumably don't even really know. But this is not an issue exclusive to the movie's extras. The main group of friends we follow are just as awful. When Casey is killed, a girl that they know one of their best friends was close with and most likely knew personally, they make jokes and mock her, ironically comparing her death to the opening act of their favorite horror flicks. This kind of behavior is, to put it plainly, unrealistic, and I think that that's completely intentional. Sure, plenty of high schoolers are unsympathetic monsters. Just look at my old friend group for evidence there. But I think it's fair to say that most human beings would not respond this way when put in this situation. Be it for a need of self-preservation or genuinely caring, pretty much anyone wouldn't dare say something like this so soon after the incident. And that's the point that the filmmakers are trying to make here. These kids are desensitized, obsessed lunatics, and it's all related to their media consumption. This is an exaggeration of what the mainstream media at the time was trying to make kids out to be, and by extension, the first major criticism launched against them. But in the grand scheme of this movie's story, this is still only a small part of the arguments made. The biggest portrayal of their distaste for the news is humanized through Gale Weathers, played by Courtney Cox. When we first see Gale, it's through her show being hate-watched by Sydney. She was reporting on Casey's death before mentioning the murder and assault of Sydney's mother, causing her to turn off the TV. I remember seeing this and thinking to myself like, wow, how heartless is she to report something like that, before realizing that I do the exact same thing every day at work. When we see Gale again in the time leading up to the party scene, she pursues Sydney to press her for more information constantly, sneaking around the back of a police station, waiting outside of her school, anything to get her hands on an exclusive story. She is constantly breaking ethical journalistic codes to get her subjects on film either doing something incriminating or making statements to back up her theories. And this isn't all just played up for the camera either. She's genuinely ballsy enough to stand her ground and tell Sydney that she thinks her testimony is going to kill an innocent man to her face. Furthermore, Gale not only regularly covers these subjects and her theories on them, but she's also writing a book throughout the course of the movie about the murder of Sydney's mother. And a lot of her actions are purely in service of getting more publicity and potential sales for her new book. Even though Gale is a much more well-regarded character now, during the film's production, that was far from the intent. She was meant to be an unlikable caricature, as evidenced by Wes Craven initially refusing to give Courtney Cox the role because she just wasn't mean enough in his eyes. This is because Gale is a major point the film is trying to make against the media, because they blame horror for exposing kids to violence and the occult and attack the filmmakers for profiting off of it. Yet here they are discussing arguably worse violent topics that aren't fictional, all the while lining their own pockets from advertiser money and book sales. And they do it with more influence too. They have print, television, and online sources. But when people wonder where kids are learning about these so-called dangerous topics, they point the finger at Warwick Davis in a leprechaun costume. But if you're still not convinced that this movie is more about taking on the press than it is about parodying slasher tropes, just take a look at the climax. Stu and Billy have just revealed themselves as the killers when Sydney asks for a motive. Like usual, they spend a lot of time referencing scary movies, implying that to be part of the motive. Although, eventually, Billy does give an actual motive. Mommy issues. But Stu, on the other hand, seems surprised by this, as if he had no idea of Billy's motive and simply thought they were doing it for fun. When Sydney asks him for his motive directly, he says something interesting that I think often gets misread. Take a look.
Hello?
Oh, Stu, what's your motive? Billy's got one, the police are on their way, what are you gonna tell them?
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive. We'll rip you up!
Stu commits these acts purely out of blind devotion to Billy, or more accurately, because he's so easily impressionable. We're supposed to see humor in the absurdity of how stupid this motivation sounds, but it is again one that the media claimed all kids could easily fall victim to. It's ridiculous. But the biggest piece of evidence comes from the line that Billy says at the very peak of the terror.
You sick fucks, you've seen one too many movies.
Nah, Sid! Don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos! Movies make psychos more creative!
And this is where we get the movie's official thesis. After showing us the absurdity of the way that teens were being painted, and after displaying just how hypocritical the media is, Billy gives the takeaway. Yes, it is true that some psychopaths have been influenced by movies, but at the end of the day, they would have always been psychotic. It isn't the fault of the film industry that they're like that. If not for horror, they'd just find inspiration for how to carry out their despicable acts elsewhere. And you know who the best alternative is? Hey all, thank you all so much for watching this super short video essay on Scream. I just recently watched it all the way through for the first time, and I have to say I'm absolutely in love with it. I'll definitely cover a few other films before I come back to it, but let me know if you'd like to see more from me regarding the Scream franchise. But with that said, thanks so much for watching, and remember, believe to achieve.